The more intermediaries in a financial flow, the more at risk it is.
What kind of emotions does that bring out of you?
Man, that's a whole different podcast. That's such a good question. I mean, this is a really perceptive question.
Today's guest is Ryne Saxe, the co-founder of Eco, a company that is quietly building the stablecoin infrastructure that could one day rival Visa. In this episode, we break down how Eco routes stablecoins across blockchains, what makes their approach different from traditional finance, and why moving money might never be the same again. We also get personal, talking about the shutdown of their first product, the emotional cost of being early, and what's next for programmable money. If you're curious about where crypto is headed beyond the speculation, then this episode is for you. And if you find value in conversations like this, please consider subscribing. It helps us keep bringing on thoughtful builders like Ryan. Enjoy the episode.
Ryan, why should someone who just uses Venmo or USDC care about what you're building at Eco?
Because Venmo and USDC want access to stablecoins, and we flow stablecoins better. I guess USDC is one, but Venmo wants it, and so do most fintech products. And so what we basically do is whenever a fintech product or a crypto wallet helps someone get on chain, either by giving them access to USDC or some other stablecoin, to the extent then they want to do something else on chain, Eco very often is the infrastructure that helps them get from point A to point B to do that thing. And the way it used to work is if you got ETH or some other cryptocurrency, and then you discovered some other on-chain opportunity that you wanted to take advantage of, and you didn't happen to be at the right place, you had to figure out how to get your tokens there, how to do the thing in a sort of a long and arduous journey that most people would churn from. And what's different about today's environment is that if you hold a stablecoin, it should be good enough to go do whatever else you want to do. There's good enough infrastructure on the back end to take your stablecoin, route it, and sort of bring you through the other side in a secure place with access to the thing that you're trying to ultimately get to. And that's where Eco sits. We help sort of connect that journey for the average app developer and the average end user who's holding a stable. And that's why you care. I think another interesting thing about us is we spent a few years at the app layer. So we understand really well what it means to try to bring people into a mainstream consumer product, to hold a stablecoin, why they would be interested in doing that, where you might want to lead them from there. And so we have, I think, a great deal of experience and empathy with that user journey and with helping app developers construct that user journey for the average person. And so I think that's something that really benefits us as well.
So most people, when they're sending money, they just know that it works. But what's actually broken behind the scenes in the way that money moves right now?
Yeah, it mostly works. But I think that what people may not realize is there's sort of a patchwork of intermediary steps and checks that need to happen that make it work. And each of those comes with some sort of trade-off with respect to your data or some fee that's added to the stack. And what crypto makes possible is just a more seamless way to move money that's far more efficient. It could be faster, it could be cheaper, it can be global, out of the box. And so I think where people really feel the pain is when money movement doesn't work as seamlessly as it should. Of course, it's easy enough for me to send someone a payment on Venmo, but that's a pretty US-centric perspective for that type of product. It's far more painful when I have to make a cross-border payment, when I have to go through my bank, whenever I get some sort of error message that I need to go through additional verification steps in order to be able to send that money that I thought was already out the door. That's where you run into a lot more friction that sort of brings to the front end the reality that there's a lot going on behind the scenes, a lot more dependency in the flow than people are really aware of. And an interesting way to think maybe about stablecoins, just as a starter, they're just a better way to move money. It's kind of a more programmable way to move money, inherently global way to move money, kind of an evolutionary step beyond banking in how your dollar might move. And that has benefits for both sides of the transaction. Now it's just sort of up to us to make it accessible to people far and wide.
You've said the breakthrough isn't digital money, it's networked money. What exactly does networked money actually mean in simple terms?
I think when we say networked money as a space, I mean, we're bad about this in crypto. We get very semantic, and sometimes there's some inconsistency there. When I hear about networked money, I just think about programmable money. What does that mean? It just means basically that I can condition the send and receipt of my dollars on if something happens or if a series of things happen. And I don't necessarily need 7 intermediaries to push a button to confirm that those things happened, right? You can program it into the front end. You can program it into sort of the on-chain network journey to only validate a transaction and to only fulfill a transaction if some sort of conditions are fulfilled. I can trust that that's going to happen or not. And if not, I keep my money doesn't get lost, and I can be on my way. And I think when you talk about networking money across chains, you're talking about programming that journey such that I can be confident that my money is going to move how and when and why I expect it to. And if those conditions aren't fulfilled, it's going to remain in my wallet, and I can find another way. And so when I hear networked money, I oftentimes think about sort of ensuring that money flows freely between blockchains that might not talk to each other natively, and making it programmable along that journey such that the user experience can be one click and lightweight.
It sounds like the main problem that you're solving for is fragmentation. So when you think about a regular wallet, a bridge, or other stablecoin apps, I mean, it sounds like that's the main differentiator. What are some other things that make Eco different?
One is the programmability element of being able to use a stablecoin to do whatever I want to do. That's sort of somewhat unique. For us, we're pretty opinionated that holding a stablecoin on chain should be good enough to do whatever else, and that we can construct that journey. So even if you need a different type of token to do the thing, maybe you're trying to play a game that requires its own token, for example, maybe you need to pay gas on a different chain that requires a native asset that you don't hold, we should still be able to fulfill that journey for you, such that you can just push a button that says send 10 on the front end, and the thing that you want on the other side executes. And so that opinionation towards sort of one-click stablecoin-based user experience is something that's very important to us. That is something that we've built the hard way in the past, so we understand for the average developer what we can abstract away to enable that to be a faster development process for them and a simpler development process for them. I think another sort of unique problem that we're solving is we're basically sort of underneath that, creating kind of a marketplace for stablecoin liquidity. So right now there's a lot of demand for stablecoins, and there are a lot of interesting opportunities that happen on different blockchains: Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, some others that people have heard of. And in the past, you just had to have money in the right place to be able to access any of those things. Well, now what's interesting is stablecoins sort of can denominate the journey between all those otherwise isolated regions of crypto activity. They all are adopting stablecoins. And so if you're holding a stablecoin sort of anywhere among them, then not only should we be able to get to where you need to go, but we've sort of created a market layer to ensure that there's sufficient capacity in stablecoin liquidity for the chains and the opportunities that are most in demand on any given day at any given moment. And so the part of Eco that the average end user might feel because that their app just works, but might not actually see, is there's actually a marketplace for liquidity sort of underneath all of that we are constructed to ensure that whatever sort of protocols are doing the best job of acquiring users and building the things that are in demand have sufficient liquidity at any given moment so that people can access them.
When I was looking through your website, it seems to me that there are 3 main components that kind of make all of this work. It's routes, accounts, and crowd liquidity. Can you walk us through each one of them and explain how they work together to make money flow seamlessly?
Yeah. And I think sort of the high level point to keep in mind is these are each optimized for stablecoin liquidity and or stablecoin user experience. The reason we build each of them is to tightly integrate a stablecoin user journey. Routes and accounts, I think are pretty easy to understand actually. We oftentimes sort of draw the analogy of Eco's kind of like interchain Visa. That's kind of our opportunity. So you don't often, like Visa generally just works, so you don't really have to stop and think about what it's actually doing. But if you do stop and think about what it's doing for a minute, it's kind of doing two main things. One is it's moving currency between banks that don't otherwise interoperate. So it's a currency exchange and settlement network. And the second thing it is, and people don't really stop and think about this very often, is it's actually a user experience. That's pretty remarkable. It's a very lightweight user experience, such that I swipe or tap wherever the network is accepted. And we think that sort of an analogous solution to Visa could be built on chain, and it would standardize a very simple and lightweight sort of stablecoin based user experience to get across the network. And ultimately it would settle stablecoin volume in transactions between these different networks. And that's sort of what routes and accounts do. Routes move the money. Accounts, kind of like the chip on your card, call data to the network to make sure that you just need to have a very simple front-end experience, and the programmability of what your transaction sort of requires ends up sort of going through the other side. And that's what we mean with routes and accounts. So with routes, we're connecting chains and flowing stables between them. With accounts, we're abstracting that at the UX layer to enable an app to sort of just have a one-click stable send experience across that network. And crowd liquidity is really where you make a crypto. So if routes plus accounts are interchain Visa, crowd liquidity is that liquidity marketplace element that means that the yield and the fees earned by that network are going to the stakeholders that are powering the network and that are providing capacity to the network and liquidity to the network. So crowd liquidity is sort of that liquidity marketplace element that ensures that the network always has liquidity where it's most in demand, and that the unit economics of the network's volume and the network's yield share are effectively going to network stakeholders. And, for the people in the audience that might skew a little bit more DeFi native, a really good analogy for crowd liquidity would be sort of constructing the largest cross-chain order book for stablecoin liquidity, right? Hyperliquid is very, very popular right now. Hyperliquid did a really interesting thing in the early days. They created this Hyperliquid vault where people could supply USDC, and that would provide sort of a lot of the maker liquidity in their kind of like early bootstrapping phase, and return a lot of sort of the market making strategy yield to the LPs in the pool. This is like very, very analogous. Basically, crowd liquidity takes sort of otherwise excess stablecoin liquidity, utilizes it to serve cross-chain stablecoin order flow, returns the yield to participants in the network, and effectively constructs an order book for stablecoin liquidity where it's most in demand. And that's what we're really excited about. So routes and accounts are in some stage of production today. Accounts is earlier, accounts kind of alpha state, whereas routes has been in beta all year and is flowing pretty appreciable volume. Crowd liquidity will be sort of the big reveal as we get through summer. How do you participate in this? What are the incentives for doing so? How does that spin the flywheel even better?
You've really perfected the analogies and just bringing it down as simple as possible, which ultimately is what I feel like this industry is missing a lot of times when you talk to founders and what they're building. I get all that. Now, can you walk me through the actual traction? Like, who's actually using Eco today?
Well, yeah, it's pretty simple. Today, Eco tends to be the fastest and cheapest way to move a stablecoin between certain chains. That's just like a very simple value prop. Okay, who wants that? A couple different types of market actors want that today. The professional DeFi actor who may be doing some looping strategy, maybe farming somewhere, may need to recycle capital across chains relatively quickly to support a trading strategy. They're looking for speed and capital efficiency, and our routes provide both to the extent that they're sort of sending stables. And so what we see in our own routes data is a lot of looping with people who are sort of actively trading between some different strategies on Ethereum rollups. That would be one good example. Another actor is kind of slightly different profile, a little bit similar but different. Market makers that are just recycling capital across chains to supply markets and or support intent bridging. That's another actor. These tend to be actors that need to move stablecoin liquidity at some size with some frequency. And that's where our routes tend to be pretty performant. And then a couple months ago, we launched a front end for our routes product. I didn't want to, actually. My team talked me into it. I was right. They ended up being wrong. Or I was wrong. They ended up being right. I got that exactly backwards. But they're just like, people want to use this. People want to send stables. Why don't we give them a window to do it? I didn't want to because I thought it would pigeonhole us in the bridge space. And turns out we launched it. They won that debate, and we've seen a lot of organic volume that's just purely one-off. Good example, Optimism's running its summer program right now that's incentivized to take advantage of certain DeFi strategies. So we see a fair amount of people just single shot sending stables to try to access that program and those incentives. And we might not see their wallet show up for another few weeks, but it tends to be just like purely organic. I need to move a stable between these chains. Eco seems like the best way to do so. Now they have an interface, so I get to go about it that way. So my team won on that one, and I'm glad they did, because we've seen a fair amount of volume through that interface. Those are the three major actors we see right now. Now, where this gets bigger and more interesting is when you start to see chains themselves and stablecoin issuers themselves want to support this as something that's like very natively or tightly integrated. And that's the traction we're starting to see now. We've shown enough velocity, enough volume, enough organic demand, which is not incentivized, right? Just based on the merits of the product, that now we're seeing aggregators and chains and stablecoin issuers themselves think about, okay, should we integrate Eco's routes as sort of as like the fastest, lowest fee way in? We see crowd liquidity coming. We want to be early to that. We would like to have a crowd liquidity deployment for our asset or on our chain. And that's where I think that this starts to get really compelling, because you're seeing those market dynamics organized of those stakeholders that are very influential and for whom we're ultimately trying to build a liquidity platform. So that's a little bit of like who's using it today, with a little bit of a look ahead as to what does that lead to tomorrow. And we're pretty excited to see that developing. That's kind of what we've hoped to see going into the summer.
It's good that you surrounded yourself with teammates that give you perspective that you may not have.
Oh my gosh, this happens all the time. I'm so proud of our team.
That's great. That's great. So we touched on who stands to gain, but what about what part of the current system would you say does this disrupt the hardest?
The more intermediaries in a financial flow, the more at risk it is. That's a really good way to think about this. Now, I would say there's like so much room to play in this sandbox for both TradFi fintech as well as kind of Web3 fintech. The stablecoin market is already big. It is going to be absolutely enormous. Okay, like the size of the theoretical stablecoin market is like the size for dollar flows in the world. That's like that's the TAM here. So there's like lots of room for traditional players to come on chain and realize a lot of value. And there's also tons of room for crypto protocols and sort of Web3 native products to create a lot of value and capture a lot of new value themselves. And so both sides of that stand to gain. I would say what's going to be most disruptive is how many intermediaries are necessary for you to transmit money from point A to point B today. If it's, where I would look at foremost is probably the card processing stack, where a lot of people may not realize that there are several checks and several steps and several fund routing steps that need to happen in order to confirm a card transaction as valid and settle it later on. And if you need 5 or 6 or 7 intermediaries to ultimately share data and pass funds in order for any given transaction or batch of transactions to go through, then you're probably looking at a pretty disruptive threat to that funds flow today. And that's not really a hot take. The card networks know it. Looking back 5 years from now, I think people will view them as some of the early entrants into this space. They're already dabbling in it and have been for a few years, because they understand that this technology is both inevitable and an evolutionary improvement that has important consequences for their margin and their own business structure. And I would assume they're going to figure that out. But right now, I think it's not a coincidence that There's some of the earlier TradFi actors that you see in this space. Visa has been watching and participating in this space for at least 4 or 5 years now because they understand its consequence. And that's evidence of kind of what I'm saying here. So the more middlemen, the more at risk.
Visa, MasterCard, you're absolutely right. They definitely have their finger on the pulse on this, and interesting to get your perspective on that. Now, I know you've been building for what, like over 7 years now. I mean, what's been the hardest part for you, technically, personally, emotionally? I mean, you're trying to build infrastructure that most people don't even realize they need yet.
Yeah. Man, it's a whole different podcast. There's a lot of there's a lot of scar tissue and a lot of learned wisdom over that long. Surviving is not that hard for that long if you really believe in what you're doing. I would say that one of the more difficult things during that journey has been we had for a while a product that was that we're very proud of, that was working. And if you've heard of Eco, it's probably because of that product. Actually, it was a USDC based bank replacement app that did really well for a couple years, and we were very early on this curve. I think now you'll see a lot of stablecoin based fintech apps and neobanking apps under development. We were doing it a few years ago, but we were doing it, I think, critically before the banking and fintech sector had accepted stablecoins as legitimate and inevitable. Even USDC, we're a little bit early too. And I think that the hardest thing along the way is that we basically did really well with that product for a couple of years, but we sort of ended up on defense with it, and somewhat under attack in the whole debanking movement, and we couldn't keep that product online. And so shutting down, the product that gave you your first taste of product market fit, shutting down the product you've worked on for 3-4 years and you're really proud of, having to see half your headcount out the door because their roles didn't translate to the roadmap, sort of with that product gone, was definitely, I think, that the darkest moment, or sort of like the darkest stretch. But in weird ways, if you just keep building your learnings from those things that didn't work, if you're in it for the right reasons, they come back around and somehow end up informing and benefiting the things that do end up working. And I think that's been the case for us. I think we're uniquely sort of capable of holding UX and infrastructure development in our head at the same time because we've now built at both layers. And so that was probably, I think, the most difficult part of the stretch. And unfortunately, we lived to see the day. And I'm sure if we were given another half hour, I could dig in even deeper in some seasons of the company. But that would be probably the darkest stretch that I would highlight, and sort of leading the team through that, finishing the right way, seeing people out the door that in sort of in feeling like they finished well, and seeing them out the door and into the market to the next thing in a gracious manner. Was all a challenge we were confronted with in 2023, and we got through and found our way to kind of the product and the layer we build now. But that was a tough stretch. And I think that when you look back, we built a lot of things we're proud of, but it's the classic adage, too often, if you're too early, it's the same as just being wrong. Right. And you're proud of what you built, and maybe your thesis is actually correct, and it just takes longer to develop. And we've had to see ourselves through a couple of those seasons. And that was one of them. And, right now it feels like we're right place, right time. So hopefully we make it stick.
So when you see events like Circle, IPO, what kind of emotions does that bring out of you? Is it the positive emotions? Is it the negative emotions? Like, what are you feeling when you hear Circle going IPO?
That's such a good question. I mean, this is a really perceptive question. It's like 80-20, 90-10 positive, right? Because that's beneficial to what we're doing now, and what we're doing now is working. And so the older stuff feels increasingly like water under the bridge every month we get down the road now. And so something like that news event, Circle's success, really I think is positive for us. It's validating for us. There's solidarity in it because Circle has had to find its way for as long as anybody in the space, and it's had their own trials and errors. So I look at that and really appreciate it. And then just, as you perceive, there's just that little glimmer of bittersweet in it. That's just like, man, our product was like the way to access and utilize USDC in the United States. And it was the portal. And it was just generally a product we're very very proud of. And so there's that little glimmer of bittersweet in knowing that, that was the case, and, that'll be somebody else's opportunity. Fortunately though, we found our way to our own big new opportunity and it's working well. So, that doesn't drag too much.
So sticking to the present and looking into the future, if eco works out like you envision, what new possibilities does that unlock for developers, users, or just global finance as a whole?
For developers, it's pretty clear. Especially, we kind of have like a two-phase go-to-market approach. The first phase is like at the infra layer, network as many dollars across the chains that matter as possible. Once you've done a good job of that, you can move up to, I think, serving the app layer better. And that value prop is pretty clear for developers. If you only want to build for stablecoins, that's all you need to worry about. And that this drastically simplifies your front end, right? Even if you have a very on-chain native use case, if you can translate that use case into just stablecoin based UI UX, we can take care of the rest. That means fewer numbers, fewer variables, fewer acronyms, all crammed into your UI. All you need to expose to a person is a dollarized, unified, spendable sum. And then you can let us construct the transaction logic and the on-chain execution to ensure that your use case is fluid. And so I think that's really interesting because it exposes crypto-based development to developers who may not be kind of Web3 aware or Web3 deep. It just feels like building a fintech app. But it also allows crypto native developers, if they want to translate their use case into a stablecoin denominated UX, to do so very simply. And I think you end up with a higher conversion user experience as a result. It's meeting people where they are with more familiar patterns and fewer clicks.
Very much so. And sticking to the theme of looking into the future, what's something you believe about the future of money that most people, even people in crypto, still don't see yet?
I believe that there is yet to be built, and we this is our earliest days, and is thinking about and trying to run this experiment. It was just too soon. But yet to be built is an alternative currency that has purely on-chain monetary policy that's highly, highly effective. And something between stablecoins and Bitcoin. Right? Bitcoin didn't really behave like money yet. Stablecoins are great, but with the obvious trade-off that we're pegging them to the external dollar system. And I believe yet to emerge in the space, you need really good multi-chain tech, you need really good oracles, you need really good governance incentives. But I believe that sort of yet to emerge in the space is some independent currency model that may not need to be fully backed by collateral or over-collateralized, that has highly, highly efficient on-chain governance of its monetary policy, and that people are increasingly willing to transact with. And that was kind of our original dream. We weren't the only ones. There were a lot of projects in kind of the earliest Ethereum days thinking about payment currencies, recognizing that Bitcoin was not really psychologically correct. And we were all just too soon, right? We were all crypto pilled, and we thought that the people were going to be willing to adopt that type of thing much earlier. And it turns out you just need stablecoins first to get people on chain, and then it starts a journey. And I think where that journey ends up, maybe several years from now, is with the emergence of a purely on-chain native currency that leverages on-chain data, leverages fast, sort of high fidelity on-chain governance, gets the incentives and distribution right, and that you see people gradually willing to subscribe to. It doesn't mean they're moving their whole life to it, but it may mean that there's sort of a parallel on-chain, maybe AI influenced economy that increasingly supports its own internal currency. And that seems pretty far out, but I think there's a few things and simple truths that we have with crypto. You got better data, you got better transparency, you have programmable incentives. And if you start with those three ingredients, you can probably construct a currency model that's pretty compelling. And maybe we have to move the world to stablecoins before we really get there. But ultimately, I think that that's something that crypto makes possible. And so I hope to live to see the day, basically.
And does this future currency resemble anything like a flat coin?
Yeah, but flat relative to what? That's the interesting question, right? I get the phrase, I get the term. What's interesting though is like, it only needs to be low volatility relative to how people are using it. And that's what I think is really interesting here. Stablecoins are low volatility because, we're just importing the dollar, so to speak, and they need to be low volatility relative to all these off-chain things that we may also be doing with our money. But as people start to do more and more and more on-chain, does that sort of reprice this concept of an alternative currency? I don't know. I think just now you have me in kind of like nerdy territory, right? And kind of dreamer territory about what we might see someday. But if you have really high velocity currency that's only being used on chain for its own kind of independent basket of use cases, then it really only needs to kind of adhere to, some pricing against those use cases, maybe not against the rest of the world outside. And that's pretty interesting to me. That's kind of a pipe dream that I've cared about for a long time. But the immediate challenge is to move dollars on chain first. Get sort of some relatable concept that bridges people on chain to kind of maybe go deeper over a period of years or decades, and we'll see where we end up. But that's the key value in stablecoins. It's a critical link in the chain. You're not going to get the world on chain without something like a stablecoin. And that's where we need to sit, and that's where we need to focus today.
And is the Genius bill to you the catalyst to make all this work?
I don't think it's the catalyst to make all of it work, but I think it's probably fuel in the flame. I think it's already working. Even if you could quibble about certain elements of the bill, which you always can, about any given bill that comes out, I think it's like critically sort of a legitimacy stamp on this technology being inevitable, which many of us who have been here for a while have just like on its own sort of technical basis we've believed that to be the case. But when you have the policy recognition of this asset class, and of this technology, then that means the rest of the world has accepted it too. And so I would just view it as fuel in the flame. It'll be something for us to react to. There may be some sort of structural changes in the market that we need to price in, but obviously it's net positive. If it's not shutting it down and it's otherwise endorsing it, yeah, that's huge, a huge boon for the space.
It sounds like there's just so many moving parts that you have to take into consideration: the technology, the regulation, and as I found today, and as the audience have found out, you've been through some dark times, but from everything that I'm hearing, it sounds like things are moving in the right direction, and you're definitely in the vertical that seems to have a lot of eyeballs right now. So it's really neat to see that Eco is kind of front and center for all that. Ryne, where can people get in contact or follow you or learn more about Eco?
We're easy to find. That's one of the best things about Eco. So eco.com, easy to hit. And on Twitter, we're at Eco. And if you want to follow me personally, it's just my first and last name, RYNESAXE, at Ryne Saxe on Twitter. And I hope you'll keep a pulse on Eco over the summer. There's a lot that's compounding. Crowd liquidity will emerge. And so it's a really good time to record, really good time to listen. I appreciate you having me on.
I appreciate you coming on. for sure. And for those that are watching, if you found this video helpful, educational, share it with your friends, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.